Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Manisha Verghese. I'm the head of the AA's public program, and I'm delighted to introduce tonight's lecture by Salma, Samar, Damjuli on retelling history. This talk is the first in a new series, which you can see on the slide here, called New Canonical Histories. The aim has been to invite architects, artists, and theorists who are rewriting the architectural canon or retelling history from a new perspective. And that's something that we feel is vital to furthering a more diverse and progressive form of architectural education. And tonight's speaker has been doing exactly that through her teaching, practice, and writing. Salma is a British architect of Iraqi and Lebanese descent. She graduated from the AA Diploma School in 1977 and went on to do her PhD at the RCA. She worked with Egyptian architect Fathy between 1975 to 76 and then 1983 to 1984. And she also taught in housing and urbanism here at the AA until 1997. This book, Fathy, Earth and Utopia, which is on sale at the back of the room tonight for a special price of £40, and I really recommend you all buy it, has its roots in her time in Fathy's office, but it also originated in some form here at the AA. I thought it was really wonderful when she shared with us that she was introduced to his work when she came across a black and white print that was being developed of a screen he had designed, and it was being developed in the AA darkroom. So the talk is titled Retelling History. And the book is a sort of catalyst to discuss Fathy's career that moved away from the status quo and introduced a new dimension and strategy to inform contemporary and Arab architecture. Fathy was a revolutionary who rejected the professional norms and practice consolidated by capitalism's building structures, facades, and townscapes. And he was working on an architecture that was more original and rooted in the place and culture of the region. It was one that relied on natural resources and the accompanying crafts and building techniques that were used to construct his fabulous architectures. There's so much more I could say, but I know you're probably all anxious to hear from Salma. So I will hand over to her now, but I also just wanted to mention that after her lecture, there will be a portion to ask questions, so please prepare yourself, because I think it would be great to have engaging discussion after tonight's talk, and we'll also have a drinks reception upstairs in the front members' room, so please do join us for that as well. So please join me in welcoming Salma back to the AA.
Thank you, Manisha, very much for organizing this lecture, for inviting me here, and we should thank also Amira Sulh, who initiated this with Eva Frank, so I would like to thank them both in their absence. And I can't tell you how odd, weird, and wonderful it is to be back in this place. It's as if one has never left it. But this was the same lecture hall that we all attended when we were students some time back. Anyway, as you mentioned earlier, this lecture coincides with the publication of a book that came out in the summer, although the publishing date was October. And the reason I'm showing you this book has nothing to do with buying copies this evening. I mean, you're welcome to do so. But it's because this is the book which really celebrates, as far as I'm concerned, all the work and labors and travails of Fathy and his whole discourse and theses, if you like, whether in philosophy and culture or whether in his practice and his profession. It also echoes much of his own language and spirit, which was very, very rare to come by in our part of the world that is undergoing all the upheavals it is. It has to be said, and on behalf of my publishers as well, that we would like to thank the sponsor of this book, Salman Salim bin Laden, without whose support this book would not have been published. And this is quite important because this book has been in the making for at least 20 to 25 years. The story is there. It's in the introduction, so I shan't repeat it. But the outline and the book and the fact that Fathy wanted all this material to be published in the early 80s was what prompted me to actually put it together. Now, where did it all start, as Manijay said? And I told her I only discovered this when I only remembered this when I was writing the acknowledgements. And I acknowledged someone who was a tutor at the time at the AA called Omar Al-Farouq, who's Egyptian. And we were doing a project. I was in my first year. I was doing a photography project, and developing these black and white photographs. And there I saw being developed this print in black and white, which looked amazing. It had the kind of intricate spaces, a detail, if you can imagine, of the matrix that you see in the Mashrabiya screen there on the right. And this is one example of it. It comes in different examples. You can put all the lights out if you like. I'm fine here. You can put them all out. Maybe it's better. And I remember looking at it and saying, what is this? And I didn't know the guy. I didn't know Omar. And he told me, oh, this is a mashrabiya. I hadn't heard of a mashrabiya because where I come from in Iraq, we don't call them mashrabiyas. And then he said, this is a mashrabiya, and you know, we are working with this architect. And I don't remember the rest of the conversation. Now, according to, there were three other people involved also with Omar Farouq working with Hassan Fathy at the time, and they were John Norton, Alan Kane, and Farouq Afshar. Originally also students here at the AA. They were graduating in their 5th year when I was in my first or in my second, I can't remember, and they told me more about Hassan Fathy, and John claims that it was he and Alan who were in the dark room, not Omar al-Farouq. But the story continues that on my in the summer, during the summer of my first year, after I did first year here, I was spending the summer with my parents in Beirut because we had a family house in the mountains. And I was walking in a cafe, and suddenly I bump into John Norton, Alan, and Omar, and they all get up and we all hug and we kiss each other and blah, blah. Such a surprise, huge surprise. What are they doing in Beirut? And suddenly this small man gets up, older man, says, what about me? Don't I get a kiss as well? I said, yes, but who are you? I was a bit embarrassed. He said, I'm Hassan Fathy. And of course I couldn't believe it. I had just read his book, and I was Architecture for the Poor. And from that day on, we became very close. I would go and see him all the time in his hotel. Then I joined him on my year out. Of course, there were a few other visits to Cairo. But when it was my year out in the 4th year, and I came and I told, at the time, Alvin Boyarsky, who used to sit with us in the black room, in the bar. And when I said to him, I'm thinking of doing my year out and going to work with Hassan Fathy, he said, that's a brilliant idea. He was so encouraging. This is the street of Hassan Fathy's house in Darb al-Labana in the Citadel. And not only was he so encouraging, but also Keith Critchlow. So I have a lot, I owe a lot to this place and to friends and colleagues and tutors and chairmen and all the works, for recognizing the importance of Hassan Fathy at a time when nobody knew who he was in the Arab world, to be honest with you, and in the region. This is a close-up of another mashrabiya outside his house, and that's a view from his courtyard inside. I just would like to give you a context of what it was like to be working with him. Every day I would go and I would be met by the bawab, or the concierge Shaban, who used to be stoned all the time, wearing this brilliant blue sailor's jacket, you know, and he would be the keeper of the door. And as soon as he would receive me, he would say, Sabah al-khair ya bash muhandisa. And in Egypt, you know, a muhandis has to be a bash, or a short for pasha or something. So he had to feminize this because, and call me a bash, which is used for men normally. This is a view on the left-hand side from the upper floor of where Hassan Fathy's flat was in this Ottoman Mamluk apartment, and a plan of the apartment below him and a section through the courtyard, which you can see here. That's the courtyard that you saw in the previous slide. And the door to his studio, and then a dome in the bathroom, lit up. So he lived in this flat, which he used and resided in for as long as anybody knew him. This is me on my year out, 75, 76, with him in the studio, working at my desk. And these are the interior from his living room and main entrance. This is on the outside, before you get to the living room, on the terrace. And the soffit on the right-hand side was like a mantelpiece that is used. This is me when I went back to work with him in 84, 85, was it? Yes. After I graduated and left the AA. And in 62, Hassan Fathy joined the General Administration for Schools, 26, sorry, forgive me, in 1926, after he graduated, and then taught at the Beaux-Arts from 1930 to 1946. And so he commented on this, and he said, they wanted to build classical Greek in the countryside. This is to do with the schools administration, yes? So I remained with them till my contract ended, and then left to teach at the Beaux-Arts in Cairo. The rector was French, and when we copy from the French, from the Beaux-Arts, we are copying a waltz from Schumann, like Harpo and Chico Marx did when improvising on classical music compositions. This is because he used to love Harpo, and he used to love the brothers Marx, and then he used to say, he used to love this anecdote about going in and Harpo asking Chico, what are you doing? And he says to him, I am inventing music. I'm writing my own piece of music. He told him, but this is a Beethoven. He told him, yes, I'm rewriting Beethoven. So that's, I am composing Beethoven, he would say to him. So his philosophy mainly and culture, or his research, stemmed essentially from the Islamic architecture surrounding and dotting Cairo. You know that Cairo has the highest amount of buildings in terms of heritage in Islamic architecture. And next to his house, I mean, this view is from the terrace of his house above his apartment. And you can see the Sultan Hassan Mosque on the left-hand side here, Mamluk Mosque, Madrasa. And this is the Rifa'i Mosque, which was constructed in the 19th century, in 1869 and 1912. The Sultan Hassan was constructed in 1356-59. And he used to always take us there, and he would look at the floor, which ostensibly was designed much later, and say, he would look at the floor and say, pointing to it, he would say, this is town planning. And it took a while for us to understand, for me to understand, that he was actually talking about geometry. This very much coincided with the fact that I was working with Keith Critchlow here at the AA, and what attracted me to Keith Critchlow and why I joined his unit was his work on Islamic geometry, the analysis of Islamic geometry, which he brilliantly depicted and published. And it was the idea of geometry and the unit and the completion of a unit that repeats and repeats to infinity, and through the repetition to infinity is the shape that one can see in the geometry. And to Fathy, this coordination, organization, and creative repetition, which was never monotonous, was his idea of how architecture related to town planning. And of course, he was influenced tremendously by Arab architecture or Egyptian architecture, the vernacular in this case. And this shows one of the courtyards of a house known as a khan called Musafir Khana, that unfortunately burnt down in 1998. A view of the wind catcher, or the malqaf, and he used all these elements in his architecture. I'm not showing you these to tell you how pretty and beautiful they are, but to tell you how he instilled these elements and analyzed them and brought them into his contemporary design. This, for example, Mashrabiya panel takes up an entire wall in Musafir Khana. It's a photo I took in 1982. And it's a view of the wide Mashrabiya wall schemes from the interior looking towards the courtyard. And then it's through work with craftsmanship and these drawings. I did these drawings when I was there in the 70s working with him, from working with the craftsmen. And then you can see the language that exists, and he depended on the craftsman a lot. He did not reinvent the stuff and use it and claim it for himself. He brought the craftsman in because he thought that in the new equation of modern architecture, what was lacking was that the craftsman and the master builder were removed, and instead we had the contractor and the architect who had graduated from a school like the Beaux-Arts in Cairo or wherever else that knew very little about Arab architecture. So the whole concept of the Mashrabiya became symbolic, and as far as he was concerned, this is a derelict courtyard of a traditional Cairean house in Old Cairo. And he wrote a play, a story actually, called Al-Mashrabiya in 1942. And Fathy possessed a vivid and compelling imagination that he used remarkably and creatively in sketching while outlining and investigating his line of inquiry through the stories that he had written, and there were two of them. These stories accompanied him fondly for his entire life. He often recalled them, quoting passages and anecdotes from them, and they represented his form of his unrequited love, like his quest and unbuilt projects, unfulfilled, incomplete. And this is what the story talks about. It's the love of these two people who fall in love, Mushtaq and Mahbouba. Mushtaq is the one yearning, and Mahbouba is the one who is beloved. And he plays on these, and it's a play that moves between modern times and the 14th century. And so it runs in two different acts. Anyway, it's one of the works that I translated into English and had published in the book. And his other story that he cared a lot for was called Utopia, and this is where the title of the book comes from. And where he got the idea of when he was painting and drawing, and this, although is undated, this drawing, I think it probably comes from the period of the 1930s and 40s, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. But this, for example, he called the utopian landscape, and it's private farmhouses overlooking Lake Qarun in Al-Fayoum. This is the story of Utopia, which we published in the book, and I used the Arabic script, of course with an English translation, and the drawings there were done by a friend of his, an artist, British artist called Bernard Rice, who lived in Cairo between 1942 and 1943, and he did these original woodcuts. His influence, where did Fathy's influences come from, and what inspired him? Originally it was Nubia. And this is a gouache that he had done, which shows Nubian houses with colored doors. The first time he went to Nubia was in 1941 to visit with students from the Beaux-Arts, where he was teaching. And later he was to go back in the 60s and do a design, do a complete survey, I'll show you parts of, and he also did the design, and you can see here the elevation and sketch of the eastern part of something called the Academic Museum. at the High Institute of Social Anthropology and Folk Art in Aswan. This was supposed to be a museum to preserve the various forms and rebuild and construct the various forms of vernacular architecture that were going to be lost due to the rising of the water of the Aswan Dam after the dam was constructed in the 60s, in the early 60s. So he went on a mission. They were all invited, he and some other architects, to go on a mission. And he went in 1962 to study this and look at this Nubian architecture before the villages were going to be submerged. So what Fathy did was to actually take 2 or 3 people with him, and they sat and they surveyed all these houses in what eventually become the Nubian survey, or what I call the Nubian portfolio. And he was very quick in understanding the Nubian communities and their way of life. And he wrote a very beautiful piece in Arabic, this is not the translation in English, talking about the socialism that existed within the Nubian community, or the Nubian society, which freed it from the need to acquire or adopt any other forms of building. Because it was there that he discovered the builders, and it was there that he took those builders with him to construct the architecture that he had done. But this discovery happened in the 40s, although the documentation happened later. And these are some slides I took of the villages that the Nubians had replaced after their towns and villages were flooded, and they rebuilt these towns in new areas. These photographs were taken in 1984 in a place in Aswan, outside Aswan, in Gharb Aswan, a village called Gharb Aswan, and one called Abu Rish. And this shows one of the walls decorated with the classical buraq that people do after they come back from Mecca. So in his book, A Tale of Two Villages, where he documents what happened in Gorna, because that was the biggest project and the biggest tragedy in his life, he writes that he made the trip across the river, and then on entering the first village, Gharb Aswan, I knew that I had found what I had come for. It was a new world for me, a whole village of spacious, lovely, clean, and harmonious houses, each one more beautiful than the next. I realized that I was looking at the living survivor of traditional Egyptian architecture, at a way of building that was a natural growth in the landscape. It was like a vision of architecture before the fall, before money, industry, greed, and snobbery had severed architecture from its true roots in nature. And he documents this when he is recounting the story of Gorna and talking about the influence. What about Gorna? Gorna is his most famous, and it's his what a lot of people consider his failure, or what he considered a tragedy in his life. Gorna is across the Nile on the west bank of the Nile, across from Luxor, on the west bank, where all the pharaohs, the lands of the kings and queens, the valley of the kings and queens, and the other tombs that existed there. And the whole story, some of you might know, was to move the inhabitants of just below the mountains. This is another gouache by him. And this is a view of Deir al-Bahri, which is a temple of Hatshepsut. But people were living below the mountains in literally cave houses. And the government wanted, the archaeological and cultural department wanted to move these inhabitants from these caves and build a new village for them. And he was entrusted with this task, which he describes well. I'll read a quote. These are the granaries of the Ramesseum, which go back to 3rd century BC. So the vaulting isn't anything vernacular out of the blue or an architecture without architects. It actually does go back to that period. And this is the Colossi of Memnon, which overlooked the land of the New Gorna, what the New Gorna village. So in the back you can see the mountain and some of the caves. And then he says, he says, it needed a very self-confident architect to start building there, within sight of the temple of Deir el-Bahri and the Ramesseum, under the minatory eyes of Colossi of Memnon, gazing coldly over the countryside towards our site. And of course, he wrote this in hindsight. This is a plan, one of the colored hand-painted plans showing the 4 parts of the village. And what happened is that it was meant to be designed in various phases. And this is a plan of the center of the village of Gorna, showing the public buildings, mosque, village hall, theater, rural sporting club, and the village craft exhibition space, and Khan, which is right here. I'll show you the theater a bit later as well. The theater is right there. And to the east, the market and the craft school. These are some other drawings that he had done of the housing schemes or streets that he designed there. There wasn't a house which was exactly like the other. He interviewed every single inhabitant that was supposed to live there, and these houses were all designated to various, to the allocated families that were interviewed. And this is the master builder, Ala ad-Din Mustafa, who worked on all of Hassan Fathy's projects everywhere, from Saudi Arabia to New Mexico. And Fathy also trained a lot of young boys and builders to build, and had documented the technology of vault and dome construction, using that in his contemporary building and developing it as well. And this is one of the most important aspects and contributions of Fathy, in that he took this technology using, of course, materials that existed in situ, and mostly it was earth, bricks, and sometimes baked bricks were used for the foundation, or stone. And he developed this in his designs to build an architecture that he thought that rural Egypt and the communities, the less privileged communities, were entitled to have, because he used to always say that they live like princes in their own houses, and the government wants to give them matchboxes out of concrete that all look the same and are all repetitive. And these are some views of Gorna prior to the flooding, which took place immediately after it finished. This is a drawing of the mosque in gouache, and this is the mosque in 1984. Of course, the mosque in this part of the world, in our regions, is always preserved. No one dares let a mosque fall derelict or anything to come of it. So they always preserve the mosque, and it's always well kept. And this is a partial plan and elevation of some Gurnese houses. And a view taken in 1946, this is one of Fathy's photos after the construction of Gorna, showing the boys' primary school, and in the foreground, on the left, is the village hall, which you can hardly see. And this is a view of the theater in New Gorna after it was completed in 1983. So the theater was restored, and I'll tell you a bit about that too. The village market with a series of arcades and a pigeon tower, these are earlier buildings. And then in 1946, shortly after the village was completed by Fathy and the opening celebrated with officials, the Gurnese decided to flood the village because they were not wanting to go and move to live there. So the village was completely inundated by opening the banks. And of course, when the Nile had raised, and the entire town was submerged. And the best excuse that the inhabitants had was that it was a village that was cursed by the pharaohs, and in particular the Memnons that I showed you, the colossi of Memnon. Some of the people went back to live there, including this family who were the guardians. He built himself a house in the village, and as you can see, the interior of this one, I mean, the houses look terribly miserable. The whole village is extremely derelict now. And in 1984, he got some funding and decided to restore the theater. This is a plan of the theater. Actually, this is a plan of the village hall, the theater, and sporting. He had done a sporting club and village exhibition space. So the theater is here. And these are the other, and the main public square is out here. This is the Khan. This was a photo in 1975, taken by John Norton, and these are two different girls from two different periods. Hassan Fathy took the one on the left, somewhere between the 40s and 50s, and the one on the right was taken in 1983. The architect, James Richards, who was editor of the Architectural Review for a very long time, I think he was editor from 37 to 71, visited Gorna in 1967 and described it as being the title was Gorna, a Lesson in Basic Architecture, and he describes it as he was very poetic about it, but he describes it as being wholly modern, with no feeling of pastiche. Its combination of repetition and contrast, variety and simplicity, embellished by the planting Hassan Fathy writes of, appeared as the epitome of the coordinated plan. And yet the value of the experiment being social more than visual, it stood only as a monument to the achievement it might have been. And this was 67, of course, because the actual inhabitants that village was designed for never really went back to live there. And a lot of families came and squatted there and changed the buildings and the shape of the architecture that he had originally done. On the left is the mosque, and on the right-hand side is a slide of the theater after it was restored. And this is the theater while it was being restored. He brought the same builders who built the town to come and restore it 40 years later. And the renovation was sponsored by Institute for Appropriate Technology that he had set up with funding that I believe he received from sponsors that he had in Kuwait. And these are some of the photographs showing, slides showing the builders plastering on the outside and working on the inside. And he used to always say to me, we need a revolution, especially when he was in despair, a mud brick revolution. Without one, we won't be able to do anything. And this is another view of the theater entrance, a section that he had designed in 45-46. More recent views of what the town looks like now. It's pretty dire, but this is a view from the Colossi of Memnon in 1988. What happened after Gorna, and the big disappointment for him, because no one could really do much, and the government was totally inadequate and impotent in this situation. He was asked to design a school in Paris. And after he designed it, and this is the plan, it was very successful, he suffered another problem with the bureaucrats saying that it cost 10 times as much that it actually did. It cost something like 37,000 guineas at the time, and they accused him and reported him to the minister saying that it had cost some 60,000 or something. And he was really furious, and he decided to leave Egypt. He joined Doxiadis and went to Athens. And he lived in Athens between 1957 and 1961, where he worked with a lot of projects, including one that related to acoustics, of course, a theory of Doxiadis, and a project called City of the Future. He developed projects for Doxiadis in Pakistan and in Iraq, and did some studies during that period also of the vernacular architecture in Africa, which he included in his study on the City of the Future. And this is a study for the Korangi House project, plan of a settlement center with the mosque and public buildings in Pakistan. And this was in 1959. And this is a perspective of the same project. In Iraq, he worked on Greater Musayya project, which was a rural housing for farmers, and that they did in different types and details. And he also developed the Balharizia lakes for them. He developed different public areas and schools, but much of this was aborted after the 1958 revolution in Baghdad. He stayed in Athens till 1961 and then returned to Egypt and was offered a huge project to work on and to design, and this was to do with desert architecture and designing the project of New Bariz. This was in the oasis of Kharga to the west. He then managed to design and work on this and develop this whole system of several villages, again, of which only one phase was built. And this shows the construction of the vaults, as you can see there, of the vaults, and some drawings showing the sections and elevations of the craft center. And it was one of the few buildings, the craft center, that was actually constructed. And he had already proposed one in New Gorna as well, to teach local people how to make mud bricks. So his system of building entailed that the young boys and should always be trained in building so that they could be self-sufficient and independent. It was way before this whole thinking of sustainable architecture came to light, or earth architecture, or self-help housing. He was working on self-help housing and doing schemes and planned for it way in advance of when it became established in the architectural discourse and design. And this is a view, again, of the craft center on the left, and another view through a passage also of Bariz. So the village is this little market and the administration building. This village was also deserted, and why it was deserted at the time or never occupied was because of the 1967 war that took place in Egypt, between Egypt and Israel, the rest of the Arab world and Israel. And and these are some of the plans that he had done for it, and studies showing the roads, the vehicles, the animals. He had developed a whole scheme, including a health center and for a workshop for women and their involvement, and etc. While all his public projects were kind of defeated by the system and by bureaucracy and by a lot of his colleagues who were much more interested in modern architecture and having adopted all these forms in Western architecture that everybody was very happy with at the time in order to associate with being modern in that part of the world. Fathy continued working with his scheme and technology and builders, and by then started to get offers to do private housing. And this is one of the houses he did in 1967 for somebody called Dr. Fuad Riyad, and it's in the Sa'ara Road in Giza. But his work in the traditional and vernacular had started much earlier. This is a farmhouse that he designed for his family in 1940 for the peasants that were on the land, on his family's land in 1940. So by then he had already started using and built, designed and built. And this is one of the earlier houses that he had designed for a colleague of his, an artist called Hamid Saeed. And with him, they had created this society of Friends of the Arts and associated from very early on the importance of art to be associated, to the importance of art to work along and in parallel with architect, and artists and architects got together. And Hamid Saeed was a ceramist, and he designed this house and built it for him, and they still live in it to this day. These are some views of it. And this is a drawing of watercolor that he had done and pencil on butter paper dated March 1944 of showing an elevation of two semi-detached houses from a group in Azba, which is on a farm built in sun-dried mud bricks. So already by this time, he was designing this architecture. This was done in 1944, and this was a rest house for an Egyptian client, Hamid Saif al-Nasr. And you can already see that he had combined the vocabulary that existed in both the Islamic, if you like, which is a very generic word, and the vernacular. This doesn't mean that he didn't attempt or build his version of the modern, and this is in 1950, and he built this house for a friend of his, very dear friend of his, called Atiya Monasterli in Cairo. And that's a view of, this is when he was on the cusp of transformation. And this is the Stopler house that he built in Luxor in the 1950s, and a more modern version of an apartment which he did for a friend, Shahira Mehriz, and this was done in 1968. It shows a section through the main living and dressing room area with this wooden dome that is called Shukshekha, and the dining room here, and this is part of the entrance. It's a very small apartment on top of normal concrete modern building. The house he built for himself is in Sidi Krer, and it still exists, and he used to use this as a holiday home or as a summer house, and he wanted this to be a prototype for buildings in the region. He built it out of stone because it was built on the Mediterranean, and this is one of the plans that he did for it, which developed, and it was, this is the bathroom with the dome, and this is the kitchen area here, and this is the terrace which he covered after he built it, and it was originally open to begin with, somewhere there. That's the bathroom here, and that's the kitchen area. That's the terrace, which was open onto the sea living room and the sleeping alcoves. And although he strived to work for the poor, he was often accused of being the architect of the rich. And this is, of course, because clients like Sheikha Hussa al-Sabbah and her husband asked him to design their house and were some of his sponsors. They actually sponsored the, I think it was they who sponsored the theater. And this house, which he designed in 1978, was built it's in Kuwait, was built in the 1980s by Omar Farouk, who I mentioned to you was a tutor here. So he took over the project, and he was very close to Sheikh Nasser, and he was the project manager, and they made special type of bricks, baked bricks, that they experimented with and used them to construct this palace home, whatever you want to call it. In the 80s, he also did design a few houses that were immediately constructed. One was Mit Rehan in Giza, and this is 1980. And there were two others. And then there was the Andrioli residence. Jerry Andrioli was Italian and his wife was Greek. And they built this house in Fayoum in 1984. And it was very simple, but that's what they wanted. His final project took place between 82 and 84, and this is when he was approached by a group of American Muslims who wanted to have their own community and village in Santa Fe in Mexico, and they had some funding to do that, and he designed a few buildings for them. All in all, he didn't have more than 5 drawings, I think. But here you can see him explaining the project to the participants and future inhabitants, and that's in 1982 in Santa Fe. Remarkably, Fathy presented 5 drawing sheets only for the entire scheme: foundation, plan, elevation, sections, and roof schematics. When asked about this by the client, Fathy replied, "I leave this to you and those who work with you to continue and develop the project with the contribution of the community and according to their needs, endorsing the decision-making and transfer of knowledge involved in the process of self-built community projects." So what he did was he took 2 Nubian master builders with him to Santa Fe in New Mexico. And here you can see Ala, the same Ala I showed you earlier, and a colleague of his. And he went to Santa Fe to train the people or the builders, whoever was going to become the builder. They stayed there for 2 weeks, and they trained them how to build the vaults and the domes, because that was the most difficult part. The most difficult part of any building is constructing the domes and vaults, because these often collapse if they are not built properly. And of course, they are built without centering in this case, or without using any formats. So this is Ala in Santa Fe. And in fact, the book ends with an interview with this guy, Ala, and talking about Santa Fe. So Hassan Fathy then said to me, "We've been fighting for 40 years and haven't achieved anything. In the USA, they had a revolution in 2 weeks." And he continued that it caused the revolution. The locals, even the women, he commented, were joining in the building, and the little children were really happy because they were engaged in and living the process. This method, which solved their problem, he added, we'd been fighting for and preoccupied with for 40 years. The method is dying here, but it will live on in America, he said to me, because it is the only solution to the housing problem. And this was him talking in the 80s, and these photographs are from 1982, and it was finally, this is an aerial view of the madrasa under construction in 1982. and one of the plans showing the main road system that he had created. This is the facade of the Mosque of Dar al-Islam project in New Mexico, and I think the versatility and all of this and the diversity that exists in his work shows ultimately that if the project was in New Mexico or if it was in New Gorna, that you don't feel any discrepancy or any kind of disharmony. It's terribly in consonant with the actual environment of the place and the landscape. And this is what he was working on: landscape, environment, architecture, town planning. And for him, it all went together. And he very much believed in not just the beauty, but the harmony and the poetics that existed in architecture. Since working with Fathy, I've been working a lot in Yemen, and there's something very interesting that in the architecture in cities that I have been working in, I've found the line that is commonly forged between the past and the future to be entirely and totally fictional when it comes to architecture and vernacular architecture in particular. Hassan Fathy's work and influence was twofold. In developing the use of vernacular architecture, as I hope I showed you this evening, materials and technology for housing less privileged and poor communities in Egypt and beyond, and in reconstructing the meaning and composition of the Islamic, Arab, or regional vocabulary, and in the architecture and the design, making, and building of contemporary towns and cities. And both were deeply concerned with the future. I hope that this was a good tribute to the man who gave us all of this, and thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Salma, for such a terrific talk. That really, I love the way you ended it, where you talked about the fictional line between past and future. I had a question to start, maybe the question portion of the evening, actually about, how you measure the success of some of the public projects is one thing, but he did receive considerably large-scale public commissions and also quite a lot of private house commissions. And at a time where maybe the value system was focused around first Beaux-Arts architecture and then kind of more globalized modernist architecture, how is he able to shift attitudes or get projects like that to convince people about a truly Egyptian architecture?
Well, at the time he couldn't. He couldn't convince them. And I remember his famous words, and we used to think he was paranoid, because we found him very funny too. He had a great sense of humor. So he used to always say to me, "They are fighting us, they are fighting us. Every day they are fighting us, you know." So it was about a battle, and it was wars. And he got these commissions. He was very lucky with New Gorna, fortunate. It was still during the regime of the king at the time. And it so happened that he was married briefly, and his brother-in-law was head of the court of King Farouk. So he was well associated to begin with, and possibly, and he had a friend who at the time was Minister of Culture. And it was through him that he got this commission to do the village in Gorna. The tragedy is that no one appreciated his work at the time, and the few people he did were either elite or were educated, and then they didn't fit in the bureaucracy and in the mainstream. So he couldn't convince them. He couldn't. But again, I showed you one side of him. I haven't told you that he was the first one to receive the Chairman's Prize for the Aga Khan, for example. And Karim Aga Khan created a special Chairman's Award for Hassan Fathy. And when he started to set up the Aga Khan Awards, he came and he discussed this with Fathy. And he's received a lot of recognition outside, and I think there's a foundation of Hassan Fathy's outside. So it's a tragedy that all of this has been developed outside and not on the inside. But this is very much the story that he writes in Al-Mashrabiya. He talks about this in that story. In this.
Questions from the audience?
Salma, sorry. Salma, you have been talking a lot about his defeats, in fact, about the bureaucracy, whatever it is. So I would like to know, is there any other example in the world, not in the Islamic world, where a designer, an architect like him, had succeeded in promoting traditional architecture, founded on tradition, against the modern architecture? Is there any other Indian or Chinese, whatever, architect who was able to do that, what he wasn't able to do?
Doshi did some in India, and the Iraqis in the 60s were very, very clever with the modern architecture, but they had another perspective. They didn't come and create vernacular architecture. They instilled a lot of the language of vernacular Iraqi architecture and put it in modern building, like the work of the office of Iraq Consult, and our friend here, Wujdan, was a member there. So they were very successful, Rifat Shaderji and company. And they were very successful in creating a modern dialogue, if you like, using some of the elements, but they used, although they used bricks, because baked bricks is the traditional way of building in Iraq, they also did use a lot of concrete, and it was a very modern take, which was also very successful, but not in the same way that Fathy developed it, in terms of going out to build for the rural, to build mass housing, where each house was designated and designed for its user. He never considered that he didn't believe in designing one house and repeating it 150 times to create mass housing. He didn't believe in that, you see. And, but the system, I think, there was a lot of, also, as you are quite aware, a lot of corruption in housing and building. And in North Africa, there definitely wasn't anybody. And so, I mean, I can't think. I had somebody in mind, and yeah, no. No.
Salman, thank you very much for the great lecture, and yeah, it's for the great work as well. It's really good to basically somebody to compile all his legacy, and yeah, it's a great record. I want to share several things with you. First one is more of an observation, and I can recall reading his book Architecture for the Poor, and his early struggle with the building methodology at the time in Egypt, use of steel that was brought from Belgium, I think, and timber and concrete, and obviously they were all expensive materials, and it was kind of mainly what kind of drove his, I guess, instinct to look for solutions in a place with such a kind of rich history. And an interesting thought, but it looks like his kind of legacy is I guess, I mean, he's becoming more and more popular, especially nowadays with all the kind of all these sustainability kind of legacy and movements and trying to look for ways to build with less embedded energy. And in a way, the greenest way of building is the materials from the site. And it's not very difficult for one to look at the map of the world and where these materials can be found. And all of a sudden you can see, oh, look, there it is. It's the solution, which he came across all these years ago, and he found a way to actually build using that way. But it's interesting also to observe that there is very little appetite in today's climate for basically, pushing the limits of that. You can see a lot of examples of similar sizes and similar kind of scale buildings being built. But yeah, it's a shame to see that, yeah, it seems that the need is there, but then there is no appetite for actually, somebody to really take on that challenge.
I don't think it's a question of appetite. I think it's a question of policy and politics. I mean, that plays the main role, because the problem is that, as I think I mentioned it somewhere, is that, okay, he talks about a revolution, and the problem is you cannot have a revolution without a political agenda, if you know what I mean. And even if it was a cultural revolution, I'm not talking politics, trying to be deep here. All I'm trying to say is that these projects that he very much cared for, which were the projects for housing, and yes, you are right, there are various aspects related to economy, to cost, to materials, to climate, to, I mean, I didn't even touch on any of this because it's obvious, I think, what the advantages of building with these materials are in terms of cooling, in terms of ventilation and natural cooling, etc., in terms of heating and using the ovens that he placed in different rooms, the kachel oven, which he got from Germany, the idea that he got from Germany. All of this was very important, and the fact that he was also aware that the poor people were not able to afford either wood or steel. I mean, he never contemplated steel or any other form of material to build with. And that when they built these villages, he talks about these villages that were built in Komombo, which is a desert area in the south, and where they had this mass housing built out of units in concrete, that people had to bury their children on a daily basis because the heat, it was very hot. Of course, they couldn't afford air conditioning either. So he was deeply concerned, essentially, for these people. But I don't think it's so much the appetite, whether the appetite on a general scale or on an individual scale. It's a question of a policy. Which government is going to come and adopt such a policy to build in this way, this type of rural or urban housing? Which government is wanting to embark on this? And I see, frankly, I always thought that mud brick and earth building and architecture will come back to our region from Europe, because this is what's happening, with people like Martin Rausch and Anna Heringer, and Martin Rausch has industrialized Ramdaeus building, and he's using it technically and building in Switzerland and in Europe using this material. So yes, they are individual projects, but I think if we're talking in terms of mass housing or village building or town building, and we're not just talking of gated type of communities that are built by contractors, but where architects are involved, we really need to see some political solutions or some sponsorship, at least, to do this kind of work.
My question? When considering the situation in Egypt, how it has developed ever since in the last 4 or 5 decades after, and do you think that you as an architect and also as a modern Arab who knows the situation in Egypt, do you think that there would be any chance that his vision, even if politics and government were helpful and supportive, do you think that this vision had any chance in the reality of contemporary Egypt? Is it feasible? Is it sustainable?
I think it's feasible not only for Egypt, it's feasible for the entire region. Feasible for the entire region if you had rural and housing and housing on the periphery of towns where you have squatters and people living in different areas, including in the city of the dead and in the Zabbalin and all this area, if they had one or two schemes to house people which were similar to this, I think it would be very successful.
Considering the demographic development to you, you think it would have been, it had the chance?
Yes, yes. And this is an architecture that is viable for development. You know, when they came to restore the theater in 1984, it looked as if it was brand new. I mean, there is no, both the design and the technique and the way of building are extremely developed and terribly contemporary, still to this day. It would be very hard to reinvent it anyway. Okay.
Thank you, Khalto, for this beautiful lecture. I just want to touch upon the plan work. It seems that most of his plan work is very irregular, and there is a way that it acts away from regularity and bringing parallelism in his plan work. So I wonder if you could talk a little more about the way he draws or the way he implements or the parameters, the hectares that he uses in his plan work.
It was all freehand, and he did a lot of these drawings just sitting there, and like any architect used to do, or like we did, and maybe some of you still do, but there was, if you recall, no computer or anything. He didn't even use a T-square. It was people like myself and the other architects around who would draw these, put them scale. And he had an amazing vision for scale. He was very, what's the word? He was very prolific in the production of designs and drawings. And he used felt pens most of the time.
Do you know how long it took him to construct a project, let's say?
Construct, sorry?
To construct a plan of a project?
Depends. A plan. I mean, if it was a house, I mean, it might take him a few weeks, but then he would go and come back in discussions with the client and change things all the time. But yeah, I don't think he was very fast. Time was not a factor. It's just the terms of what the prerequisites of the projects were. And when it came to villages, he worked on different levels at the same time. He would be doing the design of a theater and design of a craft place and a design of and he had a formula. Ever since he came back from Greece, he had developed a formula. I mean, I write about this, and my co-author does analyze it very beautifully in the chapter on berries, where she talks about how the geometry and configuration that he took from the systems that he developed with Doxiadis worked in his design and in his parameters. Okay. All right. I think that's...
Just probably have time for one final question.
Okay.
What a responsibility. The interesting, actually, that I think in following from the other gentleman, I mean, I think it's interesting to think and your question as well, of the situation in Egypt at the moment. I mean, do you, in a sense, is there anybody actually trying to work with it? Because it's interesting that the Aga Khan Awards are pretty amazing socially, i.e. that the user of the building has a feedback to the awarders on. Most architectural competitions just simply is, who's got the wackiest idea, let's build it. So the Aga Khan's got sort of an idea of social projects, of actually looking at the building that's been built and then actually seeing what the users say after it. But the other side of Egypt is the existing New Cairo, the polycentric New Cairo, and worst of all is the new Cairo, which seems to me that even the geometric pattern of the floor could not possibly cope with, that you sort of said. So is there anything in Egypt at the moment where people are working at a scale? Because I think maybe there's a tremendous fight between the scale that Fathy wanted and the scale of development that is actually present at the moment. Is there anybody working at that, in a sense, more modest?
I know that there were some architects. Look, I mean, I'm not living in Egypt, and I've been going and coming over the last 2-3 years to different places. I've been going to Siwa. I haven't been less to Cairo than I am. So I am not aware of any architects who are working on a larger scale, let's say, or a scale of a sort. I mean, when you talk about new Cairo, I mean, that's a nightmare. That's a complete, honestly, nightmare, worse than any nightmare one could have imagined 20 years ago, let alone, I mean, we thought what was happening was bad in Cairo at the time. Now it looks fantastic next to all of this, you know. But this is the problem of this Dubai and Abu Dhabi and syndrome of wherever you are in the Arab world. They think that the highest point of modernization is by replicating what's happening in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi, you know, which again is a huge disaster. But let's not go there at the moment. I think what is important is to, I am not aware of a movement as such, an architectural movement, but that doesn't mean that I know. I am not aware of any particular architects or architectural movement that is happening or taking place, but there could be one, and I'm totally unaware of it. All I can tell you is that I don't think that the architectural education as such, or universities that teach architecture in Cairo, have had much to say over the last decade or two anyway. So they haven't produced any amazing, but you know that there are one or two quite well-known Egyptian architects now who are getting projects, or you know, who are stars by their own, like what's her name? Shahira something, who won this museum competition, but then she didn't win it, you know, as usual. You know, you win a competition and then it's removed from you. So I haven't seen a movement happening like this, but doesn't mean that I might be ignorant of what's happening in Egypt. So forgive me. Yeah.
Sorry, do you
More?
mind taking one more question?
Just one, yes.
Hi. I just have a quick question about one of the things I found really important in the work is how he was interviewing every single person of every single family that was going to live in something that was for a group of a whole community. And I was just wondering if there was a written transcript of his interviews, or if he shared some of the specific demands of different families, or if you have any examples of specific demands of each families that would differ.
No, he talks about this in the book, in Gorna, yes? He writes about how each family was, and he did have a lot of sheets and logs, but there wasn't, I mean, he didn't sit and document, he documented figures and he documented requirements, but there were no stories written because of the magnitude of the number of families he was working with, as you can imagine.
But so they would probably, ask requirements for sizes and for orientation rather than...
I don't think they were aware of orientation. He was aware of the orientation, but they would ask, for example, for pens for the animals. He needed to know how many, what type of animals did they have? Did they have cows? Did they have donkeys? Did they have chicken or goats? All of that made a huge difference, you know? And so, because a lot of them wanted to keep, for example, they relinquished the cows and accepted to put them all outside in a joint pen near the Khan. But they all wanted to keep the chicken and the smaller type of animals next to them because they were quite precious. So these are the things he took into account: number of people living there, number of children, and then projecting as to how many more there would be and what they required, where they worked, for the proximity of the housing next to the schools, because he had a boys' school and he had a girls' school. So all of that was taken into account.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.